workplace strategies for. Welcome to today's webinar, Violence in the Workplace, Strategies for Survivors, Advocates, and Employers, hosted by Wider Opportunities for Women. My name is Mallory Dusenberry, and I'm the Associate Director for the Economic Security for Survivors Project here at WOW. First, I'd like to do a little housekeeping. Your lines have been muted to ensure that background noise does not interfere with today's conversation. If you have any tech issues or questions during the presentation, please use the meeting chat located in the bottom left corner of your screen. At the end of today's discussion, you will have the opportunity to ask questions either over the phone or you may submit questions throughout the presentation over the chat function. We will send out a recording of the webinar along with the PowerPoint slides and relevant resources tomorrow. The purpose of today's webinar is to explore the realities in which domestic and sexual violence occurs at and affects the workplace and to outline possible solutions. Our panel of experts will discuss how violence manifests itself at work, what the consequences are for both victim employees and employers, what rights victims have, and what options are available to employers and advocates. So for those of you who are new to us today, Wider Opportunities for Women works both nationally and locally in Washington, D.C. to promote economic independence and equality of opportunity for women and girls. For over 50 years now, WOW has helped women with programs emphasizing quality jobs, gender equity, and lifelong economic security. To accomplish these goals, WOW engages in national policy advocacy, technical assistance, and research initiatives. The Economic Security for Survivors Project recognizes that survivor safety and economic security are inextricably linked and promotes strategies that foster economic security within the systems that serve survivors. The ES Project provides resources, education, training, and technical assistance to transitional housing programs and other direct service providers, state and local governments, domestic violence and sexual assault coalitions, and VAWA's STOP grant program. Our activities include on-site state trainings, guides and policy briefs, webinars and curricula development, and a monthly newsletter. So our wonderful panel today includes Maya Regu, a senior attorney with Futures Without Violence in Washington, D.C. Her work primarily focuses on the intersection of the workplace, trafficking, immigration, and gender-based violence. Maya manages Workplaces Respond to Domestic and Sexual Violence, a public-private partnership of the U.S. Department of Justice's Office on Violence Against Women and 8 national organizations that works to increase the safety and economic security of workers through training, technical assistance, outreach, and materials. Maya designs and conducts trainings for a variety of audiences, creates public education materials, engages in policy advocacy, and is the author of several published articles. Next, we have Lisa Lynn Jacobs, who serves as Vice President for Government Relations at Legal Momentum. Prior to Legal Momentum, she has worked at the National Partnership for Women and Families and the Office on Policy Development at the U.S. Department of Justice, where she focused on a number of issues, including implementation of the Violence Against Women Act, the Welfare Reform Law, judicial nominations, and affirmative action. She also served as Chief of Staff of the Civil Rights Division, as well as Special Counsel to the Director of Violence Against Women's Office. She has testified before congressional committees at both the state and federal level. And last but not least, Johnny Lee is the founder and CEO of Peace at Work and Workplace Security Solutions. He's previously served as the Workplace Violence Specialist for the North Carolina Office of State Personnel, the Training Director for the UNC Chapel Hill Injury Prevention Research Center's PREVENT program, and the Victim Services Coordinator for the Asheville Police Department. In addition, he conducted research to develop the Employment and Domestic Violence Matrix and published the book Domestic Violence in the Workplace in 2005. So before we launch into our discussion today, I would like to frame the issue of economic security for survivors. So domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking have diverse and severe consequences for survivors, including dependency on an abuser for basic needs and on survivors' ability to work, attend school, or secure safe housing. In addition, abusers often perpetrate economic abuse as a tool of power and control and to create dependency. In addition to controlling finances, compromising credit, and destroying property, one key component of economic abuse is interfering with employment. So both these two impacts, the cost of violence and abuse itself, as well as economic abuse as a tool of abuse, combine to create barriers to survivors achieving safety and independence. It keeps them from recovering from violence, being able to leave an abuser, and being able to find independence and safety in both the short and the long term. For example, shelters reported that 74% of survivors stayed with an abuser longer due to financial issues, and nearly 75% of survivors surveyed indicated that they either have trouble paying their bills or are one unexpected expense away from hardship. In addition, many state fatality reviews often find that the parties were unemployed or undereducated and that the victim was unable to leave due to economic needs. While there are overlaps of both the occurrence and the economic impacts between intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and stalking, there can also be very clear differences. For example, dependency issues are much more common in intimate partner cases, and abuse of resources such as a car, which a victim may need to actually get to work or school, while sexual assault may be perpetrated by a coworker or a supervisor who is not an intimate partner, which results in very unique impacts on employment. So what exactly are we talking about when we're talking about economic security? WOW defines economic security as having the income, assets, and access to services to meet basic needs, participate in the workforce, and build savings over the lifetime. These basic needs include housing, food, transportation, child care, healthcare, household items, and taxes. So while it's essential to be able to meet these daily expenses and reach self-sufficiency, economic security also requires having savings to protect one into the retirement future and from unexpected events such as a violent attack. So WOW calculates what one needs to earn to be economically secure across the country and down to the county level for up to 420 different family types. We found that economic security wages are far above minimum wage and at a level far exceeding the poverty line, which often determines benefits. For example, a single worker in the U.S. needs to earn about $14 per hour, and a single parent with 2 kids needs to earn almost $27 per hour. So by comparing these numbers, which you can find in our database for free at basiceconomicsecurity.org for your specific counties, we compare them with actual wage data from the Department of Labor and the census. And what we find is that approximately 60% of all women are economically insecure or are not earning wages that allow them to be economically secure. These numbers are much more stark for women of color and for single mothers. So, for example, 82% of single mothers are earning economically insecure wages. This really highlights the need for survivors to be secure in their employment if they are able to recover from an assault or escape from an abuser. Unfortunately, many jobs do not provide these wages, especially if somebody is returning to the labor market. And unfortunately, violence not only affects survivors' employment, but may even take place at the workplace. So that is really framing what we are going to be talking about here today. So to start off our discussion, I will now turn it over to Maya. Maya?
Thanks so much, and thanks for being here, everyone. I'm going to talk a little bit about the types of violence that we frequently see in the workplace and how often they occur. So we'll go over sort of the 3 major types of violence that you saw earlier from Mallory's slide. Domestic violence, sexual violence, which I am using that phrase to include a whole range of behaviors from sexual harassment all the way up to rape and sexual assault, and stalking. So domestic violence, very generally, we all know, is a pattern of coercive behavior intended to establish and maintain power and control. For the purposes of thinking about the way domestic violence impacts the workplace and impacts survivors, I just wanted to pull out a couple of things about who perpetrators can be and how this violence sort of manifests. So I think we all and a lot of employers think of domestic violence as being between spouses or intimate partners or people who have a child in common, and that is frequently what it is. But I just wanted to point out that it also occurs between family members who are not intimate partners or who are not dating, especially in the case of adult children and elder parents. So that's something you can see in the workplace as well, and frequently do see around elder abuse, especially financial abuse. In addition, I want to make sure that we don't fall into the trap of thinking of domestic violence as just being about physical violence, because when you're looking at workplace impacts for survivors, employers, and perpetrators, a lot of these signs aren't as obvious, right? So they include many tactics like emotional and psychological abuse, threats to harm families or friends or coworkers, threats to damage or harm property or take it away. Often victims will have their money or their salaries withheld from them or stolen, or the abuser may only give them a limited amount of money to get through the week. Perpetrators may sabotage and damage their property, which affects their ability to go to work and do their work. So, for example, sabotaging a car so the victim can't get to work, or cutting up or setting fire to their clothes, which is something that's happened to clients of mine. Refusing to assist with child care, or damaging the victim's housing and causing them to get evicted or incur fines. And in terms of frequency of which this occurs in the workplace, there was a study that came out a couple of years ago that looked at workplace homicides, and they found that nearly a third of women killed on the job were killed by a current or former intimate partner. So the workplace is a pretty convenient place for perpetrators to find their intimate partners and harm them or attempt to harm them. The U.S. Department of Labor did a study in 2006 and found 1 in 4 large private industry establishments reported at least one incident of domestic violence in the past year. And that's just the ones that were reported. So based on our experience, we can be fairly confident that the incidence is actually much higher. It's just that people are afraid to come forward and report what's happening to them. And then some older research indicates that 50% of the battered women who were in the study were harassed at work by their abusive partners. Next, let's talk about sexual violence. Again, I just want to emphasize that perpetrators are not just intimate partners. As Mallory said, they can also be supervisors, co-workers, they can be customers or clients that are either coming into the workplace or that the victim employee is interacting with in the course of the job. They could be acquaintances or they could be strangers. And so these are all different types of people to think about in victim safety and impacts on the workplace. And as I said before, sexual violence is a term that I use to include a whole range of behavior, from lewd or obscene comments or gestures or a hostile environment, which is usually what makes up sexual harassment, all the way up through rape or sexual assault. And what I want to emphasize here is, I think especially in the workplace context, people seem to think of sexual assault as being one thing. You have a sexual harassment policy, you do an investigation, but people don't really think that of the ways sexual harassment can easily become acts of sexual violence, like rape or sexual assault, which are crimes. And so it's important to think about the way those actions and behaviors are related to each other, and how sexual harassment is frequently a precursor to sexual violence. And here are a few statistics about sexual violence in the workplace. That this 8% of rapes occur while the victim is working, and that sexual harassment is actually the third most frequently cited basis of federal discrimination charges to the EEOC. Finally, the last type of violence that we're talking about today is stalking, which is defined differently under a lot of state laws, but generally is harassing, unwanted, or threatening behavior that causes the victim to fear for his or her safety or the safety of a family member. And again, just like sexual violence, perpetrators can really be anyone. Stalking frequently co-occurs with domestic violence and sexual violence, so you'll see a certain amount of stalking behavior that goes along with domestic or sexual violence. And it takes different forms, like following or spying on a person, appearing at a place where the perpetrator has no other reason to be, such as the victim's workplace, leaving unwanted items or gifts for the victim. And what's interesting in the workplace context is a lot of times these gifts can appear innocuous. Like maybe the perpetrator will show up with flowers or, a cute stuffed animal or something and put it on the victim's car or desk. And to coworkers, it'll seem sweet or cute, and they'll think, oh, your perpetrator is such a nice person, and when in reality it has this much more sinister undertone for the victim and is designed to make the victim fearful for their own safety. Use of technology is important in thinking about stalking because a lot of perpetrators use text messages, social media, and email, and spyware to stalk and harass and threaten victims. And stalking also has implications for company property and company vehicles as well. Stalking is actually the most prevalent form of abuse at work, and it's actually quite common among both men and women as victims. And there was a Department of Labor in Maine did a study in 2004 looking at the behavior of domestic violence perpetrators, and they showed, you can see a very high percentage of them had easy access to their intimate partner's workplace and contacted them in violation of a no-contact order. So that's all part and parcel of this stalking behavior. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the consequences for victims for this type of behavior. And something that was mentioned before was this issue of the workplace impact for victims. And we use the word workplace impact to mean things that are happening not only at the workplace, but things that are happening away from the workplace, but that affect the victim's ability to do their job, their performance, or the safety of the workplace and the victim as well. So things that commonly happen at the workplace, I think that we all can think of, are the perpetrator will suddenly appear in the workplace, which is part of the stalking. Maybe there'll be a threat or harassing or violent incident. Or, sometimes the perpetrator will be using work resources in their own workplace to stalk or harass someone. So that is, things that are happening in the workplace. Away from the workplace, many times victims will have several absences from work, maybe to attend legal proceedings, to get medical attention or counseling, to do safety planning, or to relocate to another place to stay safe. They may be tardy to work because of the perpetrator's behavior. Their workplace performance may be impacted by the violence, so they may have problems concentrating, or they're not able to finish projects on time. They may have unexplained injuries. Sometimes a lot of victims will resign from the job because of safety and performance issues rather than disclose what is happening to them to their supervisors. And sometimes when supervisors find out, they may actually terminate the victims from employment. And I think Lisa Lynn will be addressing some of the legal requirements and protections around this later on. The CDC released a study a few years ago, the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Study, and this graphic right here reports some of the intimate partner violence-related impacts on victims of these different forms of violence. So you can see that they became fearful, they were concerned for their safety, they had injuries, they needed medical care or legal services, housing, and a lot of them missed at least one day of school or work. So what are some employee survivor concerns when it comes to issues of domestic violence, sexual violence, and stalking? Well, obviously, as you saw from the last slide, they're concerned about their safety in case the perpetrator shows up at the workplace, causes a scene, or is somehow stalking them. Survivors are thinking about trauma related to the violence or abuse itself. They're worried about keeping their jobs, and similarly, they're worried about other people in the workplace finding out and judging them, or in the case of some survivors, being fired or penalized somehow for the violence and how it's affecting them. Similarly, if a survivor loses their job or is in danger of losing their job, that has a huge impact on their financial security. Sometimes it drives many domestic violence victims in particular to stay with their abusive partner instead of relocating or finding somewhere safe to be, because they don't have a separate source of income or they don't have any other options. Similarly, a lot of survivors are concerned with finding medical attention or legal assistance. They need time off from work to address all the safety and workplace-related issues. And then they're also concerned if people find out about what's happening to them, their reputation or their appearance in the workplace as well. So here are some statistics on the workplace impacts of these forms of violence for survivors. Many survivors lose time from work because of stalking. A significant amount of rape and sexual assault victims also lose time from work after victimization. And the CDC did, the last large study that was done on the cost of intimate partner violence was done by the CDC in 2003, and they found that victims lose 8 million days of work each year, which has a huge effect on their own productivity as well as that of their employers. I mentioned before that perpetrators also have impacts on the workplace, not just in terms of safety, but also economically. And I think for a lot of us who work in this area, we spent a lot of time making sure that employers and workplaces are thinking about impacts to victims and being victim-centered in their responses and being supportive of victims. What they forget, I think, is that their own employees are not just victims, but also perpetrators. And that has a lot of economic and safety and legal consequences for employers as well. So there was a study done by the University of Vermont a couple of years ago on domestic violence perpetrators, and 80% of the perpetrators in that study said their own job performance was negatively impacted by their perpetration. 20% caused or almost caused an accident at work, and what I found most interesting is that in many cases, supervisors were aware of the perpetrator's behavior but did nothing to admonish them or confront them or do anything to prevent that behavior. I think that says something interesting about how workplaces are either unaware of the issue or sort of scared to address it and confront perpetrators and hold them accountable for their behavior. Similarly, here are some statistics from the Department of Labor study from Maine that I talked about. A lot of perpetrators are late or missing work because of their behavior. 3/4 of them in this study used work resources to perpetrate abusive behavior. Sorry, there's a statistic that's duplicated on here. And now I'm going to hand it over to Johnny Lee.
Hey there, sorry about that. I had a little trouble unmuting my microphone. Thank you so much, Maya. And I'm so glad that you talked about perpetrators in the workplace, because it really is a big issue. It's the other side of the coin. A lot of attention is given, or some attention is given to victims in the workplace, but more could be done about addressing perpetrators in the workplace, because that's where we could really look at prevention and primary prevention. All that was discussed before about the impact on the victims has a direct impact on the employers. And that's really important to consider, because while we might have an employer that truly, genuinely cares about their employees, a lot of small mom and pop businesses, it's sort of a family there, and there's a genuine concern to care for your employees like family. For other organizations, it's a business, and what they do is they make money. And in that sense, that's what they care about. So that's where we could talk to these employers and try to convince them that this is a business issue. A lot of people are thinking, well, this is a personal thing. I don't want to get involved. What is it, my business? Well, what we're trying to emphasize here regarding the impact is that it literally is your business, and there is an impact. For instance, if we look at this, again, we talk about that harassing, stalking behavior that's going on. Well, while they're being harassed and stalked, they're not able to do their job. They're being interrupted. Not only the fact that it's taking time while they're talking with the person dealing with them, that abusive, harsh, virulent, the really ugly things they're saying are so distressing to the victims that they're not able to concentrate on their jobs after the phone call or after the visit. And due to that, we could see that the impact on intimate partner violence, it's the IPV, another term is intimate partner violence, has a impact on the economy. It has an impact on the bottom line of the organization. Just looking at that a little bit more, one of the biggest costs is, I'll just say this as a small business owner, that one of the largest costs we can possibly deal with are medical costs when we talk about health care. And it's been well established through many studies and through the Centers for Disease Control that intimate partner violence, domestic violence, sexual violence, and harassment absolutely has a larger cost for those victims than, let's say, general employees or general population. Now, while we can certainly talk about the physical violence and the broken bones, the trauma, the physical trauma, the emotional trauma also has an impact as well. So we can talk about depression. We could talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, which then needs to be treated, and there are interventions for that, but again, it costs money. We can see the cost. It's either given into the healthcare insurance providers, and that's going to raise all of our premiums, or it's the co-pays that the employer pays as well. And you can see those figures right there, and this is, again, is not just unique to the United States, but it's been well proven in other countries as well, as you can see through the World Health Organization. When we talk about the security issues, it's well known. I'm a member of this organization called ASIS. It's a security association, and we just did a presentation on domestic violence and sexual violence in the workplace, and it was a really engaging meeting. What we saw then of all these security directors, they knew it was one of their big concerns. As you can see, a great study by the Corporate Alliance to End Partner Violence in 2008. Virtually almost all security folks, all the veteran security people knew that this was a very complex, very difficult, and very deadly threat that is being done, that's being suffered by the victims. Now, earlier we saw different statistics looking at roughly 1/3 of victims of women being killed at work. Another study was done in North Carolina at the Injury Prevention Research Center, and this was a really good epidemiologically sound, peer-reviewed journal study looking at murders at work in North Carolina. And when we excluded robbery really is a separate subject, has different dynamics going on, different prevention tools. But when we looked at looking at co-workers or ex-employees or patients or customers and clients and intimate partner concerns, when we looked at those dispute-related incidents, we found the vast majority of the homicides committed against women were committed by ex-partners. So it wasn't that, when people think of workplace violence, they're thinking about an ex-employee coming back to shoot their boss and everyone else. Well, for women, it truly was a higher percentage looking at that as coming from intimate partner issues. And then in another study that was done by the Department of Labor, they found that at least 1 out of 4 private employers experienced some incident of domestic violence. And by the way, those with the Department of Labor, we're talking about reported incidents, and especially around these issues around discretion, around confidentiality. Many of these incidents are not reported, so I believe that these figures are much higher in reality. Now, we had a great review of looking at how employees are impacted, showing up late or not showing up at all. Again, try to think of this as an employer. If you can imagine, you've got because abuse is so common, especially for women, 78% showing up late for work. That has an impact on productivity. The University of Arkansas did a similar study, and I do a little research, by the way, and I recognize the limitations of my research. There's good research, and then there's better research, and then there's research not so great. When you look at the peer-reviewed stuff put out by a business school, the University of Arkansas study was actually within their School of Management, so it's not public health. It's not within this agenda where it might be looking at health-related issues. It's purely looking at it from an economic, business-related standpoint. And again, we're finding good evidence, empirically sound evidence, showing that victims have an impact on the productivity of the workplace. And what we could say then to the employers is, it is your business. There's a reason why we need to take care of this and address the situation. And again, when we look at the impact of stalking could be a horrendous thing. There might be, I know the other guest speakers are well familiar with the dynamic, maybe some of the attendees. The stalking, even if there's not the physical violence, it's so disruptive of the individual's lives that it almost renders them incomplete to manage even basic functions of their life, including getting to their job. If we break this down a little bit more, there was a study, I believe this was an Australian study, again showing the impact is global. It happens all around. We see things such as they're physically restrained from going to work. They're being held back. We're seeing that that sort of sabotage work, such as hiding or stealing their car keys. One thing that I found was, I didn't realize until I started looking at these studies, a common thing was around children. And by the way, with these intimate partners, sexual violence, stalking cases, when children are involved, it complicates things tremendously. And one tactic that abusers do is not show up to pick up the child from daycare or whatever, support that the kids need. You need to take care of your kids. Because they fail to take care of the children, their end of the agreement, the victims have to leave work early, not go to work, or show up late because they're taking care of their kids. There was a minor point, and again, I believe that this is a issue with low reporting, but there is the threat of deportation for, let's say, undocumented workers, that's being used to manipulate and control the victims. While we're certainly talking about the victims and there's a huge impact on them, it has a ripple effect. It has an impact on the coworkers around them. And you could read the graph what the concerns are, but if I could just relate some stories, often I'm brought into the picture where employers contact me, and when I'm getting the history of how this whole thing unfolded, it's often a coworker that comes forward. It may not be the victims themselves, or management may not notice the issues, but the coworkers who are around those victims see what's going on, and they're the ones who come forward. Now, genuinely, sometimes it is because out of concern, like, hey, I care about my coworker, I'm worried about them. But more often than not, it's issues around fear. They think, well, if this perpetrator, this abuser is going to come in and maybe shoot her, I'm standing next to her and I might be shot. And that's where you start seeing concerns about fear. Also, because the victims are showing up late, not showing up at all, who has to pick up the slack? And that's where the coworkers start complaining, and that's how management finds out. So you could see there's a ripple effect around this issue. Again, a little bit more about this. There's, again, evidence showing how employees feel compelled to cover for them regarding the abuse that they're experiencing. And this also happens for perpetrators as well. So while the perpetrators are, maybe stalking their ex, or maybe they're in jail, who has to cover their work? Who has to get their job done? It's the coworkers. So again, we're seeing an impact there as well. Now, sadly, the thing that's really sad is there's a real sense of support sometimes for the abusers. And one thing that I often find when abusers go to jail, maybe there's a simple assault and they get a misdemeanor and it's something that has a low bond, and someone needs to bond them out. Sometimes, we've all recognized that it might be the victim who bonds them out. It might be the abuser's parents. But what we find, sadly enough, it's the employers that bond the individuals out of jail because they need them back at work. And again, we're seeing, hey, it's an impact for the employers. Employers do need to care about this issue. When we see there's injury, and by the way, this could again apply to mental health or emotional trauma as well. But when you're injured at work, you have this benefit, and that's generally called workers' compensation, that a sole remedy for those victims who are hurt at work. But one of the stipulations is that it has to arise out of work because you were working and while you were working or in the course of employment. Now, we have other attorneys here who can maybe speak to employment law better than I can, but one of the points about workers' compensation is that it's a sole remedy. So when people say, hey, there's this assault that occurred at the workplace, but it had nothing to do with the person's job. They were assaulted because of their relationship or the ending in the relationship. The victims are not eligible for workers' compensation. In most states, I'm more familiar with, again, North Carolina, Alabama, and some southern states. There may be some differences. But the other cases that I followed around, like in North Dakota, that was a Julie Tassler case that was recent, the victims are not eligible for workers' compensation because it didn't have to do anything with their job. And if I may say, we might be like, well, that's the employer's out of the loop. They don't need to pay for this, they're safe then. Well, there's another impact there, and what we're talking about is lawsuits. Because workers' compensation is a sole remedy, generally you would not be able to sue the employer for negligent security or other issues because of the person's getting workers' comp. But if they can't get workers' comp, that's what opens the door for civil suits. And I just want to say, I believe that there's a real, dearth, there's a real low number of lawsuits against employers for, I track domestic violence assaults all day long. That's what I do, and I got tons of cases. And I only have a handful of lawsuits. Now, one of the issues, such as the Pine Lake shooting that was on the previous slide, a lawsuit went to court, but it was settled out of court. And so you never see the results of the verdict of that lawsuit because it was settled. Here, what you see is the short list of those that were actually went to court, and the victims won some money. Now, one little thing I want to say about civil lawsuits, one of the points is that the employer had to show some negligence, that they had an obligation to provide a safe workplace, and that kind of falls under the OSHA general duty clause. But they failed to do that. They failed to maintain a safe workplace, and they should have known that they needed to. Now, I've looked at a lot of the famous cases. You can look at Sandy Hook. Well, there's no lawsuits there. You can look at the Aurora theater shooting that occurred in Colorado, and there were lawsuits against that theater. I've looked at that case, and I do not believe that theater was negligent. I mean, they had an officer on site. It was almost it was very, 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 very hard to say they could have seen that assault occurring. The one thing I'll say about 99% of these domestic shootings, these sexual assaults that occur, is there is ample warning signs. The victims are scared. They're terrified. They know they're in danger. And while that is sad and tragic that they're living in fear, the silver lining is they know they're in danger. Now, the question is, do they tell their employers? Do the coworkers who are also in fear, do they tell their employers? And in many cases, management does know. And boom, once management knows that there's a danger, sometimes it's in your face. Like the guy's like throwing a brick through the window. The guy, I've had cases where they call in and say, hey, I'm going to shoot her tomorrow morning at the workplace. I mean, what kind of clear warning do you need besides that? And when that shooting does occur, that's clear negligence on the employer, which I believe is a greater liability towards them. So that's, certainly the whole point I want to make here is that employers need to care about this because it does impact their bottom line. Aside from all because it's the right thing to do, we have to look at it from a business standpoint. Thank you. And I believe next we're going to be talking about victim protections and rights with Lisa Lynn.
Helps when I unmute. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks, Johnny Lee, and Maya, and to Mallory for your excellent presentations. Yes, my piece of this is victim protections and rights. I had the privilege at the beginning of this week of attending the White House Summit on Work and Families. I think so many of these issues are very much in the mind of the public, with the administration and others really trying to urge employers to create workplaces that not only benefit employers, but benefit employees as well, because when that happens, the result of it is more productive workplaces, people who are at their desks and thinking about what's going on in their work lives and on their jobs, as opposed to what many of us recognize and acknowledge as presenteeism issues, which is what can happen if you are at work, but you are concerned about other things going on in your life, intimate partner violence in particular. You can be physically at work, but you can have your mind on a whole host of other things, including Johnny Lee was just talking about how abusers tend to manipulate child care and other sorts of things. If you are experiencing those uncertainties in your personal life, they will flow over into your work life in ways that make you less productive, which does not make you a less valuable employee. It just makes you an employee who, if you communicate well and have a supportive employer, can find some types of supports in the workplace that will be helpful and beneficial. And one more thing about the White House Summit on Monday. I'm not quite sure if people heard the Vice President's remarks. As the media is wont to do, they picked up on one thing that the Vice President said, and so what is not widely known but should be understood for the purposes of this particular webinar is that the Vice President talked particularly about the impact of violence in the workplace and in the lives of working women. And he basically said that one really cannot adequately address issues that particularly women are facing in the workplace if you are not talking about or acknowledging the violence against them. So what we know, and I think we have gone over this before, is that 25% of women and 16% of men experience violence and intimate partner violence at some point in their lifetime. There really is much more going on in terms of protections that are directly focused on the needs of and responses to survivors. You will find much more of that law existing at the state level, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, than at the federal level. But Maya did do an excellent job of talking about the panoply of things that someone can experience in the workplace which could constitute violence, whether or not it is at the one end of the spectrum sexual harassment, at the other end of the spectrum sexual assault. When those things are experienced in the workplace, if they are severe, if they are pervasive, they can constitute a violation of Title VII. I think most of us are familiar with Title VII, which is like much of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, having its 50th anniversary this year. Title VII bars employment discrimination based on race, on color, on sex, on religion, or on national origin. To the extent, as I was saying before, that sexual harassment or sexual assault or some combination occur in the workplace, that can constitute sex discrimination, particularly if the employer knows about it and does nothing to prevent it, or as I think has been discussed before in the context of the webinar, if the employer or someone within the employer's control is the source of the harassment or the assault. To the extent that one has a client who is experiencing that kind of violence in the workplace, and there is thought being given to pursuing a route of a federal complaint, the appropriate route in terms of bringing a complaint of that nature would be to file a complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So beyond Title VII, which I was just talking about, there are no specific sets of federal protections that address these issues. And by these issues, I mean federal legislation that is focused exclusively on the needs of survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. As I will talk about shortly, there are some other federal laws that one might look to in order to get some type of relief if you are a victim, but these are not federal laws that are focused specifically on the needs of survivors of violence. There is one bill pending in the House of Representatives. It has not been introduced in the Senate during this Congress. Many people are familiar with Congresswoman Roybal Allard's Security and Financial Empowerment Act. In this Congress, it's H.R. 1229. The bill actually has 4 provisions, and I will name that 4th one, although I have not described it here on the PowerPoint sheet, and it is because the 3 that I'm going to talk about most centrally are the ones that you tend to see cropping up in state law as well, and are the strongest, I think, pieces of legislation at the state level that one can look to for protections for survivors of violence. So those 3 key pieces of the SAFE Act are provisions that ban employment discrimination against survivors of violence. And what that would do would be to prevent employers from treating an employee differently, giving them less favorable terms in terms of their hiring or their salary or other types of compensation or benefits, treating them differently in that way, treating them differently in the workplace, whether harassing them or, giving them additional responsibilities, etc. And obviously, it would ultimately prevent an employer from firing an employee solely because they are a victim of violence. We see that happen a little bit too frequently. Some of those cases are actually quite well known. Last summer, in particular, there was a lot of discussion going on around the firing of a parochial school teacher in Southern California. Her husband, from whom she was estranged and ultimately divorced, had shown up in the parking lot of the Catholic school that she was teaching at, and had, created a distraction such that the school system thought that it was appropriate to fire this woman as well as to kick her 3 kids who were attending Catholic school as well. I'm not sure whether or not it was that one, to kick them out of school. Sometimes these opportunities can provide you with the ability to turn lemons into lemonade, however, and that particular victim decided that what she really wanted to do was to see the state of California put in place protections that would ensure that what happened to her did not happen to others. So in her particular instance, the state of California actually enacted a fairly strong anti-discrimination provision in the wake of that particular suit. But again, that is an example of why laws preventing employers from treating survivors of violence differently are so desperately needed. Another provision of the SAFE Act is that it provides unpaid leave for survivors of violence. Now, that makes it a little bit different, I think, than what we find happening at the state level or happening in the kind of discourse I was talking about with the White House summit on Monday, because in the modern era, we seem to have moved, and I think appropriately, to discussions around paid leave. Often, if you see standalone bills at the state level, however, those are some of the older pieces of legislation on this issue, and they tend to be focused on unpaid leave. Often those provisions can contemplate longer periods of unpaid leave. For instance, the SAFE Act is focused on 30 days of unpaid leave, whereas when you tend to see paid leave bills, many of which contain provisions not only related to sick days, but what we acknowledge as safe days, those paid leave provisions tend to be shorter in duration, generally about 5 days or so. The third key piece of the SAFE Act is that it makes survivors eligible, would make survivors eligible for unemployment insurance if they had to leave a job because of violence directed either against themselves or against an immediate family member. And I'm often quick to qualify this when I talk about these particular provisions. If they were enacted, the SAFE Act would not automatically guarantee that someone who is a survivor of violence and left their job because of that would get unemployment insurance. Someone would have to meet the normal other requirements that you would need in order to get unemployment insurance. For instance, to have worked for 40 quarters, if you were working part-time, to have worked a certain, the appropriate amount of time. But if you meet all the other requirements for unemployment insurance and can demonstrate that you're a survivor of violence and need to leave the job because of that violence, were the SAFE Act to be enacted, one could then qualify for unemployment insurance based on one's experience of violence, either as a survivor directly or the experience that an immediate family member had. So moving on, and I sort of adequately, I think, fleshed out the types of state law protections that I'm talking about with respect to what's going on at the state level. We tend to see three types of protections that a variety of states provide. There are only a handful of states that provide all three, but again, as I was describing with respect to the federal proposal, the SAFE Act, you tend to see three types of state law protections. They are anti-discrimination protections to prevent an employer from acting adversely against an employee because they are a survivor. They are leave provisions, and I will talk about those in some detail because they look differently. Again, not all of them are specifically focused on leave for survivors, but survivors and advocates working with them may be able to obtain those types of leave for their survivor clients. And the third piece, again, is unemployment insurance. I'm going to go back for one moment because I realized that I had mentioned in talking about the SAFE Act that bill has a fourth provision which I was going to mention, though I wasn't going to talk about it in any great detail. That provision is one that would bar insurance discrimination in lines of insurance, i.e. to prevent insurance companies from treating their clients who were survivors of violence differently. You can see that happening in homeowners' lines of insurance where an insurance company realizes because police reports have been filed that someone is experiencing perhaps repeated cases of vandalism, and then the insurance company figures out that vandalism is being undertaken by a perpetrator, and somebody may then be confronted with being required to pay higher premiums or being dropped. The same thing happens in life insurance. Previously, it was an issue with respect to health insurance as well, but that particular situation was fairly solidly addressed by the passage of the Affordable Care Act. So moving forward now to particular state protections around anti-discrimination. Only 7 jurisdictions, and I was talking fairly specifically a few moments ago about California, prevent employers from treating employees adversely because they are survivors of violence. And you can see those jurisdictions listed here. California and Hawaii and Illinois. In New York State does, as well as the New York locales of New York City and Westchester County, New York, and then the state of Oregon. I always caution and continue to caution throughout this presentation that you should always check to see what your local law provides, because often, while most of these sets of provisions cover survivors of both domestic violence and sexual assault, some of them cover survivors of stalking as well, some contain sexual harassment protections, so you should always be very clear what those local protections are. Moving forward to the types of leave, a number of states and localities have paid leave provisions. Washington, D.C. has paid sick and safe days. Portland, Oregon, I think, might have been one of the most recent localities to enact a paid leave provision. Many folks who might be part of state coalitions who are listening to this webinar have themselves been active in coalitions around state leave. I know, for instance, this year, Washington State, as well as the states of Massachusetts and Vermont, are actively working on paid leave bills. Those are often called just that, paid leave bills, but it does augur towards being aware of the fact that many of those bills extend protections, specific protections to survivors of violence again. So again, always be aware of the specifics in your locale in terms of the availability of that as a remedy for your clients who are survivors of violence. Other options, if you're in a locale that does not have paid leave, may include unpaid leave under the Family and Medical Leave Act. That one is often a little bit more complicated for a variety of reasons, because particularly if you are trying to use family leave, you have to be talking about a type of injury with respect to a survivor that is fairly severe. It has to be a type of injury that would necessitate a survivor having needing more than 3 days off of work. And so for that reason, while family leave is available as an option, literally on the books, it is one that is less likely to be available and least likely to be resorted to just because it requires a fairly high degree of injury in terms of what the survivor is experiencing. Finally, with respect to leave, many states, over 30 states, have some type of court leave statute on their books. Generally, these apply to people who have been involved in some type of crime and would give them time off if they had been subpoenaed or if they needed to attend the proceedings. But again, the devil is in the details with respect to these provisions, and it is always good to see what is going on in your particular locale. I'm going to run through fairly quickly the situation with respect to unemployment insurance. I've put before you here a relatively up-to-date state law schematic that describes to you what type of unemployment insurance might be available to a survivor of violence if, as I said before, they met all the other requirements that one would need in order to apply for unemployment insurance. There are a couple of tweaks that you should be aware of with respect to this chart. The state of Maryland is depicted in yellow on this chart because for a long period of time they did not have they had not passed legislation to make unemployment insurance available to survivors of violence. They have done so, so they should be depicted in red. The states of Louisiana and Missouri are the ones that I like to refer to as the retrograde states. Those should now, instead of being red, they should be depicted in white, because one had a time-limited statute that expired and Louisiana actually repealed its provisions making unemployment insurance available. And finally on this chart, the state of Georgia should now be depicted in yellow for reasons I'm going to get to in just a minute in wrapping up here. As you could see on that schematic, more than 30 states and territories, including the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, make unemployment insurance available at minimum to survivors of domestic violence, often to survivors of sexual assault, and in some places to survivors of stalking as well. Always well to be reminded that unemployment insurance is tied to the state where you live, not the state where you work, in terms of whether or not you are eligible. The last thing that I wanted to touch on here is that just this month there have been two, probably the first two, at least in recent memory, positive appellate decisions coming in on unemployment insurance. The first of those involves the state of Georgia, which I just mentioned, and is why Georgia should now be depicted on the chart that I showed you in yellow. In brief, despite the fact that Georgia unemployment law only has sort of a catch-all provision saying that if you leave a job for good cause, you should be eligible for unemployment insurance, their law is silent as to any benefits that survivors of domestic or sexual violence should have. Nevertheless, Georgia Appellate Court just looked at a very egregious fact situation with regard to a survivor who was being harassed and stalked by her partner. She had left him. Her mother was murdered in what the fact scenario very much sounds like a domestic violence homicide. And at her mother's funeral, her abuser showed up and made all sorts of threats, and she decided as a consequence that she needed to quit. In looking at that very egregious situation, the Georgia Appellate Court rightly decided that this was not a woman who had voluntarily left her employment, and that as a consequence she should be eligible for unemployment insurance. In the case of the District of Columbia, that survivor was not named. The name of the Georgia case, if people are interested, and I can certainly make that ruling available to you, the name of that case was Scott versus Butler. The D.C. appellant was not named. That case is called, I believe, In Re EC. Washington, D.C. does make unemployment insurance available to survivors of violence, but this person who applied was initially denied because she had permitted the abuser to come into the workplace, etc. But on appeal, the court took a close look at the fact scenario and decided that what had happened to her in terms of what I will refer to as involuntary contact with the abuser was squarely within what was being considered by the D.C. City Council when they enacted the unemployment insurance law. And so because she had a history of abuse, the judge overruled the administrative judge's decision to deny her benefits and awarded them to her. So the moral of the story there in terms of unemployment insurance, particularly because of the story that I just told about Georgia, is always make sure that you apply for unemployment insurance benefits on behalf of your client if they have to leave employment. Because even if there's no explicit grant on the books, appellate judges are pretty good about understanding what compels someone to leave employment involuntarily and may be inclined to provide those kinds of benefits. And finally, if you are talking about somebody who's a federal employee or a state employee, the federal government has policies that specifically extend protections to survivors of violence. Many states do as well. And here is information on where you can find fairly up-to-date links and citations to the kinds of state and local laws that exist on these particular sets of provisions. So having said that, I'm going to turn it over, and we're now going to hear about employer responsibilities and options, I believe, from Johnny Lee.
Thank you so much. That was a great presentation. I learned a lot from that. Let's talk a little bit about those employers. If we said that, employers do have a role and do have a responsibility and in their own interest, what could they do? Broadly, if we look at it organizationally, such as like organizational development, a core part of that is having a policy and procedures in order to take action, to be able to do what you can. Oh, there you go. Can you hear me a little bit better now? I just moved my microphone. Sorry about that. Let's talk about what employers can do. Have a policy and procedure in place. By the way, in terms of civil liability, again, I'm not an attorney, but one huge negligence, one huge liability is if you don't have a policy. If you don't have any policy, that's going to look pretty sad if there's ever a lawsuit that's coming up. Now, in terms of finding the policies, I want to point to that website that was just mentioned. Workplaces Respond is a great resource. Again, Corporate Alliance to End Partner Violence is a great organization. There's plenty of model policies out there that should be reviewed and tweaked to fit your specific situation. So it doesn't take much effort, and there's plenty of good work being done that has been done to find those model policies. Now, of course, there's one question I get a lot is, should this be a workplace violence policy separate from it should be a domestic in the work sexual violence, domestic violence, stalking policy separate from your workplace violence policy. That's your own choice. I often find organizations choose to incorporate the language, these issues within their general workplace violence policy, but it does give a better stance. It does show a better emphasis and care about the issue if you do have a separate policy. Now, while you can certainly talk about no guns, no violence, don't make any threats, an important part of the policy is showing all the support and protections that you could offer to the employees. On the other side, as we talked about how perpetrators have an impact on the workplace, perpetrator employees, we should also have language around holding abusers accountable in the workplace. Now, a policy really is just digits on a screen or, pages on a binder on a shelf somewhere. What really matters is where the tires hit the road, and that means what the employees know and what they do. And that's the real importance of training. There should be training for all new employees. There should be training for frontline employees, looking at their responsibilities and the protections offered to them, but also management should have an augmented policy or training that really helps them understand their roles. Now, trainings I often find are, done maybe at the beginning of employment or done once a year. I talk about this continual training, where we can look at flyers in the bathroom, notes in the check envelope, or little articles that are in the company newsletter. This constant reminders. The programs that I've seen that have done really well, that have good report rates, they continually put out the reminders. Hey, if there's any issues, you have a concern, we're here to help. And that's what really does the thing. You can have a great policy, you can have great training, but the point is, will employees remember and recall what they should do when they want to seek support? Now, one big thing is that employers often don't want to get involved. I'm not a counselor. This is their personal business. I don't know how to deal with this kind of stuff. Well, you don't have to. The main thing is we have typically, of course, the victim advocacy organizations that are the professionals, that are the experts in this subject, and we just have to offer that support, that emotional, psychological, legal support to those agencies so they could get the appropriate support, so it's not on the employer to get so involved. Now, for larger organizations, they probably have a employee assistance program. If you're an employer or in the business world, I do encourage that your EAP be familiar with your victim advocacy agencies. Conversely, if anyone out there is with the victim advocacy organization, I strongly encourage you to get to know the employee assistance programs. One thing, a lot of the background of employee assistance comes from like substance abuse training, and heaven forbid when there's an abuser in the workplace, what do? They send them to anger management and alcohol counseling, AA meetings, and they go, oh, well, it's a substance abuse issue. Oh, he's got an anger issue. I think many of us, I won't get into it, but know that that is not the issue. So we have to educate the employee assistance programs about their services and the dynamics of the program. Along with that, there's all the health services, legal support. We have family justice centers that pop up and other support that victims can get. And the victim advocacy agencies will be well tied in with that. Now, while there's things that the counselors can do, but there's things that only the employer can do, and that's about things like changing their workload. For instance, if they're getting a lot of phone calls, what we need to do is maybe change their duties so that maybe they're not receiving the calls directly, or it's filtered through somebody else. Absolutely, if there's something where they're physically in danger, being put out front at the front desk, or they're working outside, change their duties so they're in a safer location. So there's little things that could be done to make them feel safer and in order to avoid that harassing, interrupting abuse from the abusers. Now, one important part about all the support is confidentiality, and it's vital that employers understand how complex and, well, if I could say embarrassing, shameful. It's something that victims generally want to keep private. And through these, whatever support that they offer, they have to remember how could they do this with respect to the employee's privacy, and including them on any discussions, any support measures are important. I've seen a lot of, we all know that domestic abuse and a lot of sexual violence is about power and control. Well, give employees that power and control. Give them choices about what what they want, what they like to see done. I love the great support of relocating them, but that's a tremendous impact on the employee and their family. So have their input on these decisions that are being made as well. The other thing that HR could do, or supervisors, is providing time off. Victims often need a lot of time off due to court appointments, going to the police, going to the doctors, and they've used up their sick leave. They used up their vacation time. But you could be really creative. There's leave without pay. There's shared leave. I've done that before, kicked in my vacation days to help someone out so they could use my day off for them. And then we discussed earlier about the legal protections, such as FMLA, or some states have mandated time off for victims to get restraining orders. Now, this is something that's often forgotten about, and this is something which you want to have on your checklist to make sure that's done. Victims, when they're threatened, they're not with the abuser. Let's say they've moved out or they're in hiding. You need to change that emergency contact information. When you started working somewhere 10 years ago, you had your spouse's contact information on there as your emergency contact. Well, you don't remember what you filled out, 15 years ago when you started working there. That's why the HR folks have to remember, go back there and look at these issues, such as their contact information, and understand that the abusers will go through great lengths to get that information. A stalker will do anything to find out where that person is hiding. So we have to have HR understand that they're going to, have their place broken into. They're going to have someone impersonating themselves as an officer to get that information. Somebody's going to want to try to find out where that person's now hiding. Another thing that's often forgot about is the 401k or the life insurance benefits. And it gets very complicated, but very often the beneficiary of those those plans is whoever's name is on that piece of paper. So heaven forbid should the victim disappear or die and it's undetermined how the person died, the perpetrator, you couldn't prove the perpetrator did it, well, guess who's going to get that benefit? Guess who's going to get that life insurance money? And that's why you've got to go back, and it's the last thing people are thinking about, but if we have that checklist, remember, go and change that information. Another final thing is wage allocation. Very often people have a direct deposit into a joint checking account, and we've understood how abusers use economic control to control their victims. Well, it might be that the victims maybe never opened up a checking account and they're not familiar with handling finances. This is where we can get the support for them to open up a different account, maybe cut them a paper check for a while so they can go cash their checks to get their money, but there's things that can be done administratively that will really, really help. Finally, the real most important thing is protection. We need to protect. That's job one, right? We protect the victims, we protect the other coworkers, the client, and the workplace in general. One thing I wanted to say, going back to the impact of abuse and sexual violence and stalking on victims, is that it's a great excuse to get them fired, right? They're not showing up for work. They got this person harassing them. They're harassing their coworkers. They're leaving early. They're not doing their job. So, boom, you got the job performance excuse to fire them. I tell security professionals, you need to be allies with the victims. You need to gain their trust. So when you fire them, maybe you can think I've gotten rid of this one problem. But what happens is you've sent a message throughout your organization saying, hey, if you're a victim of abuse or sexual violence or stalking, they get rid of you. And then the next person, because it will happen again, the next person who discovers the issue will not come forward. They're not going to disclose, and that's a danger. As a security professional, I want to know everything. And if the victim is not going to come forward because they're worried about getting fired, then that's a vulnerability. That's what makes my job harder. So you want to build that trust. Now, this is a very complex situation about threat assessments. Generally, the best practices is a multidisciplinary approach to look at the threat and determine the likelihood and the severity of that danger, and then have appropriate controls put into place. This is a dynamic situation. It's not a linear process. These situations change daily, so you've got to understand that you're doing investigations, you're taking actions, you're doing interviews, and every day it could change depending upon the level of threat. What can we do to secure them? The one thing, if I could, this was my elevator speech. we have to look at parking lots and at the beginning of the shift. I've looked at hundreds and hundreds of cases, put them into a database, and what we popped out was, wow, look at this. Most of them occurred in the parking lot, and they also occurred at the beginning of the shift. So that's where we know we can put resources, where we can add additional security to help keep them safe. And regarding that, the other thing that we found with this study was a lot of these perpetrators shoot themselves or turn themselves in, or they didn't bother at all about hiding their identity, like no ski mask, no like shooting from the grassy knoll up on off to the field. They commit this act and they don't care who's seen it, and they often kill themselves. Therefore, cameras do nothing but capture it. Now, I'm a big fan of cameras if they're actively monitored, but if that's the only intervention, it's not going to stop the perpetrators in my view. But there's other things we could do. Secure those workplaces. One thing that's one of the most effective, quick, like back pocket, if someone says, you know, they got a few minutes to talk to me, I go hire an off-duty officer. It's a big deterrent to those abusers. The officers not only have their service weapon with them, but they have their radio, and immediately they can get the backup there to offer them support. What else could we do? For those victims, think about moving them to a safer location. Are they at the front desk? Are they outside? Are they easily accessible? Could they be put into a safer place? Again, we've seen a lot of the verbal harassment, the threats that are made to victims, especially stalking victims. Well, as that's really awful, and I'm sorry to hear about that, it's great that they're leaving all that evidence. So you've got a trail, you've got a digital trail that they're doing this stalking. So if we can capture that, especially in threatening messages, we could use that to go to court. Other things, again, you can read through this my list here, but one important point is a lot of times victims are held. Do you remember we talked about the physical restraint, being physically held at the home so they can't show up to work? Well, the victims can say, hey, let me call in sick so I don't get in trouble, they don't come looking around for me. Well, if you have a code word there, the victims could let the managers know that they're in trouble and they can get the support that they need. Now, again, that's the bottom point I want to make, that sometimes when I've done threat assessments, I'm so terrified. I'm like, wow, this person should be in hiding. They should throw a dart at a map and go there and just be invisible. Just get out of town. Now, that doesn't mean fire them, but what we want to do is say, hey, be in a safe place. One of my favorite things is I've heard employers say, hey, I know you've got a lot going on and your life's in turmoil. Go and take care of your life right now, but when you're ready, you'll have a job. And that's huge. The victims were willing to do what they needed to do, knowing in 2 weeks they've got a job and they can go back to work. And that was really supportive. Now, there's a lot of things we can do from legal protections as well. Some places, we all know about the DVPO or restraining orders or peace orders that the victims could get. But in many states, more and more states, you have a workplace restraining order as well. So that's another option. One thing I want to say is please don't ever push victims to get it. And there's many cases where victims, for their own reasons, it's a very complex situation about trespass orders. But if we're going to say, hey, you better get that TRO or you're going to be fired, well, there's a lot of ethical issues around there, but sometimes the threat assessment may determine that could be exasperating action, and that it may not be such a smart thing to get that restraining order. Take it on a case-by-case notice. Now, one thing that perpetrators sometimes might do some things to the workplace, like phone calls. If they're calling a lot, the victim technically is the workplace because it's the workplace phone, and so you might charge them with telephone harassment. Now, that's sort of a joke crime, right? It's a little misdemeanor. They won't even spend any time in jail. But while that charge is pending, they should not have any more contact. They should not be threatening or trying to coerce the victims or any witnesses regarding that crime, regarding that charge. So if they continue to call, that would be one statute is called intimidating a state's witness. And then you have that additional charge, and then often judges might say, hey, I'm going to put you away for a while until that court date shows up, because they realize that this person's going to continue to disregard their orders to leave the witnesses alone. And I think we can now talk a little bit about how advocates can engage employers and communities.
Thanks, Johnny Lee. And I'm going to talk a very little bit, realizing that I ran long in my previous part of the presentation, and we definitely want to get to questions. Just a few things, and I tend not to talk about these things tons because when I work with advocates, they talk about what I refer to as the unfunded mandate part of their work. But just some things that one can do in terms of engaging with survivors and engaging with community. The thing I always talk about is making adversity counts. Anybody who is on this phone or reads a newspaper or looks at the internet for 5 minutes is familiar with some tragedy that has taken place in a workplace. If that's in your community, try and figure out ways as an advocate to make that count. Approach your local chamber of commerce and figure out whether or not you can come and talk to one of their meetings and maybe give some materials and some contact information. Retailers associations, the same thing. Johnny Lee was talking about EAPs. If it's happened in a particularly, either well-known in your community or a large employer, reach out to the EAPs and see if you can talk to them about whether or not they have a policy, whether or not it's been updated, if you might be able to help connect them with people who would do policies. Things like that are fairly simple, that are low cost, that will, because as we all know, it's very difficult to get employers to focus on issues like this when everything is going well. Tragedy, unfortunately, also equals opportunity in terms of being a moment when you can get people to turn their attention to this and do some things proactively, whether or not safety planning with a known victim or just putting together a policy that will speak, hopefully, not only to ways in which they will support survivors, but ways in which they will take appropriate action against abusers if the abusers turn out to be their employees. So again, talking about those same kinds of things, whether or not you can try and figure out ways in the context of a workplace to get the ear of employees who may not themselves be survivors, but may be able to sort of ask for information for, in quotes, a friend they know in the workplace who might be experiencing some issues. Whether or not you can get employers to let you come and do a brown bag lunch, or again, reach out to the EAPs or the chambers of commerce or some of the other big entities, the big umbrella entities under which employers coalesce, just not missing any sort of obvious opportunities to get the information out there. Because the one thing I failed to say about the previous section is the kinds of laws that I was talking about, leave laws, unemployment insurance, anti-discrimination, even where they exist, often employees and survivors don't really know much about them because employers are not required to publish notice of them. So anything that you can do to get the word out there so that people know that there are protections for them, that there are supports, and that there are ways in which they may be able to get a little bit of time off to help resolve the matter without jeopardizing their job, any of that will be helpful and redound to the benefit not only of the individual survivor, but of the community and of the employer in the long run. So I'm going to stop there and turn it back over to Mallory.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa Lynn, and also to Johnny and to Maya for all this incredible information. I'm sure everyone's going to be super energized going forward and applying all of this wonderful data. So we're coming up on the end, but we have a few minutes for questions. So if you have a question, please go ahead and type it into the meeting chat, or you can try to unmute your phone as well. I saw 2 questions earlier about how to make stalking stop and how should a stalking victim get an employer to take action. I think we covered a lot of that. I think there's also great resources on Workplaces Respond as well as the Stalking Resource Center. But if Johnny, Lisa Lynn, or Maya, if you have anything to add on those, I would open that up to you as well.
Yeah, I think you've hit on, the key resources, Mallory, particularly the Stalking Resource Center, which not only I think is a wealth of information that you can get there online, but I think there's also a contact number where you can call and work through your client's situation or the situation of whoever you may be supporting to try and help get them to the resources that they need.
Right. And then one more question. So we talked about engaging employers and engaging in some of that outreach, but do you have any suggestions for engaging employers, especially in small businesses where there might not be HR or an EAP to work with?
So this is Lisa, and my reaction there is sometimes the easiest thing to do is literally just to go in and talk to whoever might be there or figure out who the manager is or who the owner is and to try to have those kinds of conversations. Because as I pointed out, you virtually cannot name a type of business that has not seen some type of workplace violence. I'm thinking particularly of a couple of years ago when several people were murdered in a hair salon. That's a sort of quintessential small business and one that's often held up as an example of a place where you might want to hand out resources, etc. Sometimes you just have to invest some shoe leather or, some cell phone minutes in calling or reaching out individually to some of those smaller businesses and trying to talk to them about why this should be a priority matter for them.
This is Maya. I was going to suggest also with small businesses, either talking directly to the owner or talking to like a local community business association, which they may belong to, or an association of that industry or sector. So there might be, like a hair salon or, a nail salon sort of association that's made up of small business owners, and you can ask to speak to them about this issue. Because especially with retail establishments, there's a huge safety issue because they are open to the public, so anyone has access to it. And because small businesses have fewer resources in terms of maybe not having security or an EAP or HR and things like that, it makes sense to think about collective steps and collective resources for them.
This is Johnny, and I've heard just the mention of salons a few times, and those are typical, very small employers. If I can point out another great resource is Cut It Out. I want to say it started right here, my hometown of Birmingham, the Magic City, but I think they're based out of Arizona now. But they have a great program for doing outreach to hairstylists and salons because they are often people who can identify victims of abuse. And so that's a great outreach thing. A second thing I want to say, again, for small businesses such as restaurants or gift shops, is you could have some sort of like Shop to End Violence Against Women Day. And I've seen these done really successful in this one day you put posters out and 10% or 30% of the proceeds go to the victim agencies. And that's just a great way to build community. You establish a contact, you're on a first name basis with them, and that's just a great step to do the outreach to those kind of service and retail places.
Wonderful, thank you. And I would also say that especially for advocates or service providers who are engaged in community response teams or task forces around domestic violence or sexual assault issues in their communities, it might be great to invite a workforce investment board or some of those other associations to attend one of those meetings to do some of that basic education or even provide resources or information about the problem to those organizations so that they can be distributed there as well. So there's one more question. So in terms of thinking about workplaces that tend to be more traditionally male-dominated organizations, such as non-traditional jobs for women in terms of, for example, construction or other trades work, where sexual discrimination or harassment might be more common, do you have any specific suggestions for how to address that? Perhaps?
Yeah, this is Maya. We do a lot of outreach and training and work with labor unions. And there's a great program that was developed out of the Cornell School of Industrial and Labor Relations, and it's called Men and Women as Allies. And so it's sort of getting at some of this and this information. And then there's another great group in New York called Connect NYC, which is about engaging men as allies in issues around violence against women. So I would just look at the programs for those two organizations.
Any last thoughts from our presenters?
This is Johnny. One thing regarding training, one thing I forgot to mention is I know some folks out there are community educators. You have to be real careful with training. Of course, you don't know there might be potential victims out there, so it's the nature of the content that you're giving, and you don't want anything too traumatic. But on the other side, regarding the male-dominated audience, I've done programs where it really backfired, where they felt like there's sort of this man-hating kind of approach to it. And I'm not sure what the exact answer is, but you have to be very cognizant of that it's not this blame. For instance, when we're talking about abuse, you certainly want to be careful with your terms. You know, I often say he, the perpetrator, and she, the abuser, but or she, the victim. And we want to recognize that men could be victims as well.
That's a great point. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you try and figure out ways whether, I used some statistics about, the fact that nearly 20% of men experience violence at some point in their lifetime. Invariably, if you, again, speak in a sort of either gender neutral or open way, you will often find out. I was in a meeting on Capitol Hill yesterday, and it came out that the staffer we were meeting with, his mom had worked in a domestic violence shelter. So if one presumes that there is some commonality of experience somewhere and does the training from that standpoint, invariably those kinds of connections will come up, and connecting with your audience is clearly the best way to be able to get them to be receptive and to get the information as widely disseminated as possible.
To your point, and this will be my last thought, to your point, Lisa Lynn, I would just say to be aware of the fact that, these forms of violence can also occur in same gender relationships, and not to keep thinking about them as male-female relationships as well, because sometimes that can keep people from seeing what's going on with the survivor, and to make sure accordingly that any sort of workplace plan and access to resources has appropriate resources and referrals available as well.
Wonderful point. Thank you, Maya. All right, so it looks like we are right at our time limit, so thank you everybody so much for attending today's webinar. And thank you so very much to Maya, Lisa Lynn, and Johnny for your time and the very valuable information you've shared with us today. Once again, I will be sending out the materials soon, and if you have any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Thank you again, and everybody have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Y'all have a great day, too.
Thank you.